All scientific evidence so far points to an Earth that is vastly older than 6,000 to 10,000 years old. We've learned this about the universe over time. But what do you tell someone in regard to what doesn't match with their literal view of the Bible? There's a conflict there, and we need to resolve that. Some people resolve it in favor of the Bible, saying the Bible is absolutely correct, and ignore whatever actual evidence there is. I find this to be absurd because it turns Christianity into a self-contradictory proposition. It also turns the idea of a revelation in the New Testament to be a complete farce. On one hand, you could say there's a God who has an important message for mankind, and somehow he only reveals it to certain individuals who then write this down. And thousands of years later, after this initial revelation, we have to rely on copies of translations of copies by anonymous authors with no originals. And then we have textual testimonies to miracles, for example, the loaves and the fishes. And there's no amount of anecdotal testimonial reports that could be sufficient to justify believing that this event actually happened as reported. Suppose this was a God and it wanted to convey this message to people in a way that was believable. Would not relying on text to do so be the way to convince people? This, for me, is the nail in the coffin for Christianity. The Abrahamic God that Christians believe in, who is curiously tribal and very specific to Israel, sounds amazingly stupid, selfish, egotistical, and oddly narcissistic. He supposedly requires animal sacrifices, burnt offerings, and wandering around in a desert for 40 years as evidence of true faith and worship to him. If it wants to actually achieve its goal of spreading this information to humanity throughout the ages, would it really make sense to rely on text or languages that die off or anecdotal testimony? That doesn't sound like a good pathway to truth, and anything that would qualify for a God should know this. On the other hand, it sounds an awful lot like the superstitious writings of Bronze Age and Iron Age Palestinians about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, to explain things that they didn't have better explanations for. If I'm using my brain for its intended purpose, and I use critical thinking skills, this tells me that either this Christian God doesn't exist, or doesn't care enough about people who understand the nature of evidence to actually present it clearly. Which of these possibilities do you think is accurate? You need faith to believe in a God, sure. But why would you believe anything purely on faith? By that argument, faith alone doesn't make sense and isn't a reliable path to truth. People take things on faith every day, but if you can't distinguish between Christianity, Mormonism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, or any other countless religions of the world, how can you assume that any of them are true? In every other endeavor of your life, such as career, school, human relationships, eating, sleeping, walking, and breathing, it's all backed by scientific evidence to be real, and can be taken on faith as reliable and true. You probably have faith about a lot of things, but they are reasonable expectations based on evidence, such as sitting in a chair, driving a car, using a phone, and walking across the street. Trust in things like that has been earned. I will grant trust tentatively until I have good reason not to trust something. I don't have faith in things that are not reliable, plausible, or feasible. But when it comes to the ultimate truth, the most important truth of all, you're saying that blind faith is required? How does that reflect on a God who supposedly exists and wants you to have this information? What kind of God requires faith instead of evidence? Faith is the excuse people give for believing something that they don't have evidence for. If I don't have evidence for something, I'll stop believing in it. That's the nature of a rational mind, and that is my only goal. The argument that Christians give is to be the best Christian they can be, and to present this argument to people who don't believe. That's called proselytizing or preaching. What I found over time is that I actually care about whether my beliefs are true, and care much less about whether it makes me feel good. I found that my beliefs weren't justified And try as you might and pray as hard as you can, but when no answer comes and no real evidence is forthcoming, should the answer be, well, you just gotta have faith? It is said that faith is a virtue. Is this really true, or is faith just gullibility? It should be evidence that determines whether or not your perception of reality is reasonable, plausible, and feasible, and also in conjunction with the natural world as it is. Church gives a lot of people some community and some values, sure, but they didn't come up with the idea of community or values. Religion does not own the concept of community values or morality. Humans are by nature social creatures, and community values happen way before religion or the idea of God. Communities decided a long time ago that cooperation and working together allowed groups to thrive and flourish, and that altruism and generosity are learned behaviors just like murder, greed, and selfishness. Community has no ties to what is actually true or false, and certainly does not warrant belief of supernatural claims. Churches have lots of benefits for the in-group, and some of them even have benefits for out-groups. Feeding the homeless is just one example. Although helping the homeless is just as much a secular activity and doesn't require sitting through a sermon or church service, secular groups don't hold their sandwich ransom in the name of Jesus. There's no good thing that a church or religion does that cannot be achieved by purely secular means, and no positive benefit that churches and religions offer can demonstrate the truth of their supernatural claims. There is a cost to deciding that you're going to take Christianity on faith, and that cost is judgment. You run the risk of passing judgment on others who don't believe the same religious claims as you or your in-group. With this comes threat of eternal torment by self-righteous and zealous believers who claim to know and have extreme confidence that they speak for their God. This just draws an insurmountable line between religious groups and secular people. It causes divisive hatred between groups, and it doesn't have to be this way. Believers have been told by church leaders throughout history to ostracize those who don't believe, because the non-believers are said to be driven by evil. This is how labels of heathen, heretic, pagan, and ungodly came into existence. This causes estrangement in families who now consider non-believers in their family to be of the devil. You can be a good and caring person and live the best life you can and still be viewed as evil because you choose not to believe something that your parents or church leaders believe. The nature of Christianity in particular is absurd and divisive, but this certainly includes belief of other religions as well. It breaks my heart to see indoctrinated people claim to know what love and morality is, and then do the most unloving, immoral things to their family members, all in the name of beliefs that they don't have enough evidence for anyway. It's unbearable to watch the people you love be so absolutely duped into a divisive, hateful religion that they think is not divisive. They think it's inclusive and positive, yet in the same breath, they can tell you that you're destined for hell because you don't take things on blind faith. Living a secular life often means that Christians end relationships and not the other way around. It's because their particular religion cannot tolerate non-belief, and therefore they can no longer associate with you. I don't know how we can fix a world where people have been so convinced that they're doing the right thing out of compassion and love and trying to help people, when it is absolute poison. It is absolutely destructive to see this happen. It would be a much nicer world if we could all deal with reality on reality's terms, not on supernatural religious claims. No matter how you look at things, it all comes back to reason, evidence, rationality, plausibility, and feasibility, and the good that comes out of this way of thinking. Take care of yourself.